I'm going to be breaking down 3 ways to improve your body awareness in your lifts and your mobility work. We're going to be using a deadlift as an example today, but all of these principles apply to any movement that you are performing. Body awareness is one of the biggest skills that you can develop in the gym, because if you are more aware of what your body is doing or where your body is in space or what the intention is of the exercise you're performing or the why, then we can achieve quicker progress and greater heights. So we want to take your movements from just going through the motions into a deeper understanding of the movement you're performing and how your body specifically is performing that movement. So again, using our deadlift as an example, let's get into our 3 ways of improving that body awareness. So number 1 is feedback. We're going to be using external feedback, internal or kinetic feedback, and we're going to be using visual cues to help you create a deeper understanding of your body and body awareness. So with the deadlift, a lot of times, especially if we're first learning how to deadlift, the hip hinge can be foreign to the body. So in order to really understand the hip hinge, we're going to use some external cues to help the body understand what it's supposed to be doing and where it is in space. So if you grab 2 sticks or do this against a wall out in front of you, and you can follow along with these or just watch and then apply them to your practice as needed. So we'll start in a hip width stance, and the sticks are going to be out at 11 and 1 o'clock, or you're going to reach those hands out in front of you on a wall. And we're just going to get into a passive hip hinge first. So you're just going to reach your hips up and back and then bring the chest towards the floor. I like this one because we're not really focusing on the hips as much as the spine. So we're really going to allow the spine to get into this passive extension, and letting the chest fall through the arms feels really good. And so we want to encourage that extension and that stretch through the spine and the torso. So a lot of times when we're here, I like to prompt some flexion and extension of the spine to then find somewhere in the middle where we're going to rest or we're going to settle to do our deadlift. So if we stay in that hip hinge, kind of stay in this L, upside down L position, and go into some flexion and extension of the spine, and then end up somewhere in the middle, that helps us find our extended spine for deadlifts. Now, as we learn the deadlift and the hip hinge position, finding an extended spine in that hip hinge can be difficult. So I like to go between the 2 extremes and then find something in the middle. Let's just try a few more of those. Flexion with that spine, rounding that spine, extension with the spine, find somewhere in the middle that's a little more active. And then we'll do one more. Flexion, extension, and then find something in the middle. So there we can really emphasize the hinge at the hips while keeping the spine extended. We have some support for the upper body in that position, and the sticks or the wall is giving you feedback to allow that spine to fully extend, the chest to come through by giving it that support. We want to emphasize when learning the hip hinge that it's a hip bend rather than a knee dominant bend, which is a squat. So we want those hips bending. You can even look down at those legs and make sure that the knees are not pushing forward over the toes. You can try to keep those shins perpendicular to the floor, and then we know we're in our hip hinge rather than a squat position. So let's go into another external feedback cue, which is going to be to reach the hips to the wall. So now we're going to focus on that hip hinge, reaching those hips back. So you'll stand facing away from a wall or a stable, solid surface. Hands can be on your hips, and then you're just going to reach your hips back to the wall. So we don't have to emphasize so much the spine with this one. We're really emphasizing the hips reaching up and back. Now, we don't want to get to the wall by bending those knees this way. So again, use that visual feedback, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second, to see if those shins are perpendicular to the floor. And if you feel like you're a little close and you could go a little further with those hips, inch out away from that wall, and you'll find a deeper hip hinge where you really have got to reach those hips back. Now I'm hinging deeper into those hips. Let's try a few more of those, finding that hip hinge. So we're using that wall again for feedback. Once you reach the wall, you know you're in that deep hinge, And if you don't reach the wall, then you know that you're not reaching and initiating that movement from the hips. So now let's do one more feedback with external cues. You can combine this one with the one that we just practiced, but we're going to take a stick and reach it behind your body. So if we're against the wall, you want it to be a little higher up so that there's nothing below your hips. But you're going to attach it to the tailbone, grab it at the low back with the left hand, attach it to the mid back and the back of the head, grabbing it right at the behind the neck with that right hand, or you can do this with the opposite arm. But basically we want the contact between the low back or the tailbone, the mid back or the back of the rib cage, and the back of that head with that stick so that our spine is fully extended. Now, as we go back into that hip hinge, if there's any part of the body that comes away from the stick, then we know that we have shifted that spine position in that hip hinge. So we are getting that feedback from the stick if we deviate from this extended spine position. And if we're just learning how to deadlift, that extended spine is going to be super important. So we are extending that spine, making sure that all 3 points are remaining in contact with that stick as we go into that hinge and then come on back up. So notice if there's a tendency that you want to kind of pull that spine away from the stick, and that might also tell you that you need to bring the upper back up slightly, and that might be as far as your hinge is going to go for now. So this is all bringing awareness to not only your tendencies or the weak points of your movement pattern, but how far you can really go in that movement pattern to begin with. So let's move into some visual cues or visual feedback, right? So we're still on that feedback number 1 point of developing body awareness. So we have our external cues or our external feedback, and now we're going to our visual cues or visual feedback. So if I'm performing my deadlift, I'm going to do a suitcase deadlift with these kettlebells. It's going to be a very similar setup to a barbell deadlift or a trap bar deadlift, although the trap bar, the arms will be a little further out to the side. So I'm going to find my hip hinge, and we just broke that down a little bit. But once I'm in this hip hinge, I can look at that visual feedback again, making sure that my shins are perpendicular to the floor, that they're not driving those knees forward. I also want to spread out my toes so I can make sure that my base is nice and solid. So lifting up my toes, spreading them out as I bring them back down, making sure that I'm nice and solid in those feet. Then after I lift up, I can also visualize that I'm trying to place the kettlebells down right next to my ankles. So if I don't place those bells next to my ankles, if they travel forward, which is a tendency, then I know that I'm usually going to be loading up my spine instead of my hips. Now we want to load the hips instead of the spine. So if I place the kettlebells down next to my ankles and I'm searching for that position, then I know I'm really loading up my hips instead of forward loading up that spine, right? So we have our visual feedback, making sure we have a nice solid base. We have that visual feedback of making sure that those kettlebells or your weight is placed right next to those ankles. And then this one is a combination of the third way of receiving feedback, which is kinetic feedback or kinetic cues. So this one we are going to look down or feel the kinetic feedback, the knees pushing out into the arms. This is really going to load up those hips and get those hips ready to pull. So once I feel that contact here, I have that feedback saying, okay, my hips are loaded and ready to go. If my knees are in here, then I'm not going to be able to get as much leverage into that pull. I'm not going to be as stable in this position. So I want to really push those knees out into my arms. Once I feel that, and then I can pull that weight up. And bring it back down, feeling that same and looking for that same feedback of knees pushing out into those arms. I can also use my kinetic feedback by thinking about a hamstring stretch. So at the bottom of my deadlift, if I feel that hamstring stretch, then I know I'm in a hip hinge. So before I lift, If I just make sure I feel long and lean back here in those hamstrings, I feel a nice deep stretch, and then can soften those knees to prep from there. That also gives me a cue, a feedback that I'm loading up the back of those legs and hips and can pull from there, right? So sometimes it's helpful to feel that cue of stretching those hamstrings in order to get into that hip hinge position. Another way we can work kinetic feedback into this movement is by pelvic tilts. So if you take your hands and place them on your pelvis, and imagine that it's a bowl of water, okay? So if I have a bowl of water, if I'm swirling that water around, right, the bowl is moving in this direction. Now, if I spill the water out the front of the bowl, that's my anterior pelvic tilt, right? So take your hands on your pelvis, spill the water out the front, that's your anterior tilt. Take your hands on your pelvis, spill the water out of your back, and that's your posterior pelvic tilt. So as you go into that deadlift, if we're still trying to find that hip hinge, it's a good way of figuring out where the pelvis is supposed to go in space. So again, we want the water spilling out the front, a slight anterior pelvic tilt going into that deadlift position. Number 2, our second way of increasing body awareness is by intention. So by changing the intention of the movement, we are able to focus on different areas rather than focusing on all of it at once. And once one area clicks, then we can focus on something else. This also helps you get so many reps and different ways of performing the same movement over and over and over. And we all know the more that you drill and rep out movements, the easier they become, that muscle memory sets in, and the more weight we are able to pull. So I'll just show you a few examples and you can follow along as well if you'd like. We're going to first talk about the intention of, instead of lifting the bells off the floor, we're going to drive the legs into the ground. So I use my various forms of feedback to get into this position. And then instead of lifting the weights, I'm going to focus on pushing those legs down into the ground to lift that weight up. That's going to have a different effect to if I think about lifting and pulling the weights off the floor. Now, what if I change the intention to, instead of pushing, I'm thinking of corkscrewing those legs as I come up. So this also feeds into those knees pushing out, where I'm able to use a little bit more leverage and the rotation from the hips to get that weight off of the floor. So if I focus on the corkscrew, a little bit different effect than the pushing into the ground. Now, you might not even visually be able to see anything different, but the intention in your mind is going to be something different. And that helps you learn about the movement. We're learning different aspects, different ways of performing that movement. I can also change up the tempo. So that's also changing the intention. I can take a really long eccentric. So once I lift the weights up, I can take a 5-count eccentric, where I'm coming down for 5 counts, trying to not let those bells fall out in front, and placing them down with control. I can take a slow concentric coming up and a faster eccentric. So I can take 5 counts to come up, really feeling each phase of that movement, and then I can go down a little bit quicker. So we can change up the tempo there. We can also pause at the bottom or the top. So I can really emphasize that loading of the position before I actually pull. So if I get into my setup and I'm just holding, isometrically pulling up, but not actually lifting that weight, I'm changing the intention of the movement to really loading up that position. And then from here, you could also program in a pull after a isometric hold. So 3, 2, 1, pull. Now I can also isometrically hold the top, where I'm really focusing on where my body is at the top of this position. Let's say I'm focusing on not driving those hips forward, really feeling that posterior pelvic tilt, and slowly come down. And so continuing with our idea of intention with the movement, we can not only change up the tempo, change the intention, but we can also variate the movement. The more variations we perform, the easier it's going to feel, the easier it's going to be to feel where we need our hips in space, where we need our legs in space, which type of deadlift we're doing, whether it's a sumo or a traditional kettlebell versus barbell versus trap bar and versus dumbbell. And we can vary it. So we could do even a single leg RDL, right? So I can take this same exact deadlift movement pattern with the kettlebell outside of the foot and load up one hip and stand up from there. All right, so I can do the exact same movement and just perform it one side at a time. We can do split stance deadlifts. Again, I'm working on loading up one side of the body. The weight's going to be in a different spot, right? But I'm still working on that deadlift movement pattern. All of these really just mean that we are repping it out and we are doing the same movement pattern in as many different ways as possible with as many different intentions as possible so that we know all sides of that movement pattern. That's the easiest way for our body to learn the ins and outs of it. So now moving on to our third and final way of improving body awareness. This is one of my favorites. I want you to film yourself. Even if you have external eyes like a coach or a trainer on you, ask them for permission to either film you or for you to film yourself. Or if you're working outside of your sessions with your coach or trainer, or if you purely work out on your own, filming yourself is a great way to see what your body is doing in space. Once you see what your body is doing in space, it's going to bring more awareness to it. Now, what I'm not saying is to go to a public gym and to take over the entire space and just film yourself and say, this is my filming area only, right? Of course, follow the gym guidelines. Even practicing your movement patterns, film them at home if your gym doesn't allow you to film. But filming yourself, performing your lifts, performing your mobility work is going to give you a lot of insights into what you're doing, what may be going wrong, what may be going right or better than you think or better than expected. And so that is your homework. So number 3 is to film yourself and then review the film. I know it might seem a little awkward at first. I promise it's worth it. It will help you progress so much quicker and help you learn so much more about your body. If you have any questions about any of these 3 ways to improve your body awareness, drop them in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.